This video is about solving by square root. So now we're going to use square root to solve a quadratic equation. We need to watch out for perfect squares, and we need to make sure that we give exact answers, which means that we do not want decimals. Make sure with each answer that we always have a plus and a minus sign, because otherwise it's only partially correct. The reason we have a plus or minus sign is because if I take the positive or a negative of the same number and square it, I'm going to get the same result. So for example, if I had -3 squared or 3 squared, those are both going to equal +9. So I need the plus or minus to show that both of those are solutions. So in number 1, we have x squared equals 100. So we're going to take the square root of both sides, and we get x equals plus or minus the square root of 100. And we know the square root of 100 is 10, so we would have plus or minus 10. Number 2, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, so I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 28. Now, 28 is not a perfect square, so we need to use our factor tree to break down 28. So two numbers that multiply 28 are 7 and 4, and 4 breaks down to 2 and 2. So I have a pair of 2's that's going to go out front and a 7 that's going to stay under the radical. We need to keep the plus or minus sign. So we would have x equals plus or minus this 2 square root 7. Number 3, I take the square root of both sides, so I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 30. 30 breaks down to 5 and 6, so there's no pairs because 6 breaks down to 2 and 3. So I have no pairs, so I'm just going to leave it as x equals plus or minus the square root of 30 because it's already simplified. Number 4, to get x squared by itself, I'm going to add 8 to both sides. So I get x squared equals 16. In order to get x by itself, I have to take the square root. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 16. And we know that the square root of 16 is 4. So we have x equals plus or minus 4. Number 5, to solve for x squared, I have to get the x squared by itself first. So I'm going to subtract 25 from both sides. X squared equals -25. Now, when I go to take the square root, I have plus or minus square root of -25. Remember that we can't take the square root of a negative number, so this is actually not the answer because I can't have the square root. It's going to be undefined. Number 6, x squared plus 14 equals 95. So in order to get x by itself, we're going to subtract 14 from both sides. So we get x squared equals 81. When I take the square root, I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 81. And the square root of 81 is 9, so we have x equals plus or minus 9. Number 7, in order to get x by itself, we're going to divide by 2 on both sides. And we get x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 121. 121 is a perfect square, so we get x equals plus or minus 11. If you're not sure if it's a perfect square, you can always type in the calculator. So if I type in the square root of 121, I get a whole number, so I don't need to do a factor tree. I can just write plus or minus 11. Number 8, we're going to divide by -3 on both sides. So we get x squared equals 60. And take the square root. So we get x equals plus or minus square root of 60. Now, if I put 60 into the calculator, I would get a decimal, so I know I have to do a factor tree for that. So two numbers that multiply to 60 are 6 and 10. 6 breaks down to 3 and 2, and 10 breaks down to 2 and 5. So I have a pair of 2's and a 3 and a 5 left over. So x equals plus or minus square root of 2. And underneath the square root, we would have 3 times 5, which gets us 15. Number 9, in order to get x squared by itself, first I'm going to subtract 120. So I get -6x squared equals -150. And then to get x squared by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by -6. So x squared equals 25. In order to solve for x, we have to take the square root. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 25. And we know that the square root of 25 is 5. So we get x equals plus or minus 5. Number 10, in order to get x squared by itself, first I'm going to subtract 50 from both sides. So we get 3x squared equals 0. We're going to divide both sides by 3. Remember, 0 divided by anything is just 0. So when I have x squared equals 0, that's okay. We're just going to take the square root of both sides. We have plus or minus square root of 0. Square root of 0 is always 0. So we have plus or minus 0. Now, in this case, you don't need the plus or minus because 0 is just 0, but we're going to leave the plus and minus just to reinforce the idea. Number 11, there's parentheses, so first I need to distribute. So 2 times 24 is 48, plus 2x squared plus the x squared that was already out there equals 0. So when I combine my x's, I get 3x squared plus 48 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 48 from both sides. 3x squared equals negative 48. I'm going to divide by 3, and I get x squared equals a negative number. Now, I can take the square root, but I should be able to notice that if x squared equals a negative number, that's not possible, so I can right away just say undefined instead of doing the next couple of steps. In number 12, I have to get the x on one side, so I'm going to add 4x to both x squared to both sides, and I get 52 equals 12 plus 2x squared. I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. 40 equals 2x squared. I can divide by 2 on both sides. 20 equals x squared. So to get x by itself, I need to take the square root. So I have plus or minus 20, and 20 breaks down into 4 and 5, 2 and 5. So I have a pair of 2's and a 5 left over. So I would say x equals plus or minus 2 root 5.